Hello class. Okay, so for today's topic, we are going to continue with our discussion about the state in the global concept. Okay, so previously we have defined some of the political terms like politics, governments, and others, and also identify or discuss about the state and of course, the state institutions, which are the executive, legislature, judiciary, bureaucracy, and the military. And now we are going to talk about how the state evolved or kung paano nagsimula ang state. Okay, so in your opinion, how does the state evolve? So paano ba nag-evolve ang mga bansa or mga state? Okay, so pwede bang isulat nyo dyan sa comment section kung meron kayong idea kung paano before continuing or before watching the whole video lecture. Okay, so you will answer that after this tutorial. Alright, for the photo that I am presenting at this moment, these are the photos depicting the Roman Church and the feudalism. Okay, so why did I presented this? Because these two are these two dominated the European government in the Middle Ages. So we have here the Roman Empire and the feudalism. So paano ba nagsimula ang bansa from this standpoint? Okay, so we have here first we have here the hierarchy of the feudalism. So after the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, pumalit ang feudalism. So ano ang feudalism? So the term feudalism and feudal system were generally applied to the early and central Middle Ages, the period from the 5th century when central political authority in the Western Empire disappeared to the 12th century when kingdoms began to emerge as effective centralized unit of government. Okay, so that is feudalism. Another, it is a political, military, and social system in the Middle Ages based on the holding of lands in the fief or free and on the resulting relations between the lords and the vassals. Okay, so that is the meaning of feudalism, and as you can see in this photo, you can see here the king as the highest of all the stratification. So we have here social stratification. We have here the king, nobles, the knights, and the peasants. Okay, so feudalism is based on the land holdings. Okay, so kung sino ang mas may malawak ang lupain, sila yung mga naghahari-harian during that time. Okay, and they tend to invade other places. Okay, so we have here the king, under it are the nobles. So the nobles are the wealthy families, and of course the knights who are going to protect the nobles and the king, and the peasants who serves as the taga-alaga or taga-prepare ng mga foods or services sa mga knights and vassals, nobles, and of course the king. Okay, so that is the government system during the time that existed in Europe. Okay, so the question is, how did these two become the defining political units of the modern world? So paano nga ba? Okay, so feudalism and imperialism is spreading across Europe, and the photos here shows the traditional machineries that they always use during wars. So we have here spears and others. And we have here now the introduction of the gunpowder. So the introduction of gunpowder in the 14th century transformed military skills and tactics as organized infantry replaced the knight on horsebacks. Okay, so nawala na yung mga traditional tactics na ginagamit nila. Like let's say for example is the horseback. So medyo nag-i-improve or nagmo-modernize na yung mga military equipments nila. Okay? The result was aggressive, competitive, and expensive arm race. Right? And then, between the 15th and 18th centuries, military manpower in France and England grew almost tenfold. Okay, so mas yumabong pa yung hidwaan between Europe, especially in the countries in France and England. The result of the increasing improvements of technology, it requires fresh thinking from rulers. Kings needed administrators to recruit, train, equip, and pay for their large standing armies. With the growth of the bureaucracy, local patterns of administration and justice became more uniform, and then rulers began to establish formal diplomatic relations with their counterparts abroad. The outcome was more centralized monarchies, which developed England, France, and Spain in the 16th to 17th century. Okay, so since war is indispensable and it is spreading across Europe, and we have here the 30 Years' Wars also between the Protestant and the Roman Catholic, the leaders of the states in Europe decided to meet and discuss about the policies in order to end or prevent war that will happen in the future. So we have here now the Treaty of Westphalia. Okay, so the Treaty of Westphalia is a series of peace treaties signed between May and October 1648 in the Westphalian cities of Osnabrück and Munster. The treaties ended the 30 Years' War between the year 1618 to 1648 in the Holy Roman Empire and the 80 Years' War between Spain and the Dutch Republic. Okay, with Spain formally recognizing the independence of the Dutch Republic. Okay, so that is all about this Treaty of Westphalia. Okay, so we have here included the most prevailing treaties that is included in this treaty. So we have here the 80 Years' War. So this is a revolt known also as the Dutch War of Independence of the 17th province against the political and religious hegemony of Philip II of Spain, the sovereign of the Habsburg Netherlands. Okay, so one of the discussion that transpired during the Treaty of Westphalia, or during the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia, is the 80 Years' War between the Dutch and Spain, since Spain is trying to Spain colonized the Dutch. And also we have here the 30 Years' War between the year 1618 and 1648, and initially this is a war between the various Protestant and Catholic states in the fragmented Holy Roman Empire. Then it gradually developed into a more general conflict involving most of the great powers. Okay, so these are the two important wars that were noted in the Treaty of Westphalia. Okay, so upon reading or upon understanding the content of the Treaty of Westphalia, we can see here that the treaty laid a foundation on the word sovereignty. Alright, so in order for us to further understand or to go deeper into the meaning or principles that is laid in the Treaty of Westphalia, let's discuss the principles under it. So what the number one here is that states were all free and equal. Okay, so ibig sabihin walang mas mataas, walang mas sovereign. So all states are free and equal. Another here, the principle of non-intervention of one state in the international affairs of another, meaning a country will not intervene with another country because the two countries both have their ultimate sovereignty. Okay? So there is the non-intervention. Ibig sabihin wala nang colonization dapat. Alright? Another is there was no temporal authority higher than the state. Okay, so the church will not intervene in the state affairs. Okay, so sabi dito there should be no uh, there should be no temporal authority that is higher than the states. It is it signifies the separation of the state and the church, which until now we are experiencing. Another, states have ultimate authority over the conduct of their internal and external affairs, the principle of state sovereignty. Okay, so mas na-emphasize pa dito. So they should have an ultimate authority over the conduct of their internal and external affairs. When we say internal affairs, we always refer it to the activities of the government within the countries. And when we say external affairs, we refer it with all the activities or jurisdiction of the countries outside its territory. Their international relations with other countries falls under the external affairs. So it says here that countries should have an ultimate authority. So it is talking about in here. It talks more about the principle of the state sovereignty. The next, the capacity to exercise rule over a territory bestowed the right to rule. Might makes right. And we have here the last one. Whoever gained or seized power had authority to act as the head of the state and enter into agreements on behalf of the people. Alright, so these are the principles that is laid in the Treaty of Westphalia. Okay, so we should not always forget that the Treaty of Westphalia started everything. So after ng treaty na yan, nagkaroon na tayo ng iba't ibang internationalist ideas. We have here the liberalist internationalist ideas. We have here the nationalist internationalism. We also have here the socialist internationalism. So apart from that, marami pang nag-exist. So, yung sabi ko kanina, although some of the countries adhere with the principle of the Treaty of Westphalia, however, in some countries hindi. Dahil nga ang France matigas ang ulo, so with the leadership of the late Napoleon Bonaparte, inintroduce niya ang kanyang Napoleonic Code. So, yan yung gusto niyang i-introduce sa Europe and later on with other colonized countries, and one of it is Spain. Okay, so ang Spain and other countries, so gusto niyang i-introduce yung Napoleonic Code niya. So that's all about the Treaty of Westphalia, and let's try to take a look at this diagram. So this diagram shows or depicts the evolution of the state. So we will trace it here from the two form of government of Europe before. So we have here the Roman Church or the Roman Empire and the Feudalism. And during that time, there are wars that existed, colonization between neighboring countries of Europe and within Europe itself, and of course imperialism. So until such time that the Treaty of Westphalia was signed, and the Westphalian Principle uh, laid or is considered as the basis of other countries to gain their freedom and their sovereignty. Therefore, the decolonization process had begun. So under decolonization, uh, the state now gained their sovereignty, and of course, under the state, there are IGOs that were formed, NGOs, and other organizations. Okay, so that is the this is the evolution of the state. Okay, so let us try to talk more about the process or on how state came into existence. Okay, so we will try to talk about sovereignty, contract, and consent, and others. Okay, so let's try to discuss first what is a sovereign. So, a sovereign person or ano ba ang sovereign? Magkapareho ba ang sovereignty sa sovereign? Okay, so according to Bodin, sabi niya dito, the one seated above should be responsible for legislation, war, and peace, appointments, judicial appeals, and the currency. Such concentrated authority is clearly far removed from the decentralized medieval framework of Christendom and feudalism. Okay, so he emphasized that any person who is leading or who is seated above or who is considered as the ruler should be responsible of the following. So we have here legislation, war, peace, appointments, judicial appeals, and the currency. So that is according to. Okay, so let's try to look into the idea of Thomas Hobbes on the presence of a sovereign, because he supported the belief of Bodin's on the need of a sovereign. And according to him, life is impoverished without a leader who can enforce the peace. Okay, so it says here that he located the sovereign authority in a contract between the rational individuals seeking protection from each other's mischief. Okay, so sabi niya, if the sovereign failed to deliver social order, people would no longer be under an obligation to obey. Okay, so there is a contract, there is an obligation. In this way, the sovereign serves the people, no longer the other way around. The religion becomes entirely a matter of inner conviction. Okay, so that's how Thomas Hobbes defined sovereign. How about John Locke? Okay, so sabi niya dito, he argued that citizens possess natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Okay, so these things, according to John Locke, are just a natural rights. So, ibig sabihin natural. So, when we are born, meron na tayong freedom to life, liberty, and property. Okay? So, sabi niya dito, these rights must be protected by rulers governing through law. So, life, liberty, and property should be protected by a leader. So, according to John Locke, there should be a leader who is working in accordance with the law. Sabi niya dito, citizens consent to obey the laws of the land if only by tacit means such as accepting the protection which law provides. Okay? Sabi pa niya. But citizens can withdraw their consent and institute their magistrates should the rulers violate the natural rights of the citizen. Okay? Okay, so it is the consent of the citizen uh, to obey the laws, and in return, the government should protect also their rights. But they can always withdraw that consent if the ruler or the sovereign will violate the rights under life, liberty, and property. So that is consent according to. In addition, Locke further insisted that political rulers are not just benevolent father figures caring for a national household. So sabi na dito, rather, it is a political relationships are based on a contract and consent. So there should be a contract and a consent between the leader and the constituents. Okay, so these ideas of sovereignty, contract, and consent were reflected in the contrasting ways in the two most momentous and tangible affirmations of modernity. Okay, so we have here the American and French revolutions. The American Revolution, in which the colonies established their independence from Britain and went to create the United States, gave substance to the Locke's liberal interpretation of the state. Okay, so the example of the American Revolution uh, is the interpretation of his liberal ideas when American gained their independence from Great Britain. Okay, so we have here, so after the sovereignty, contract, and consent, we have here now the expansion. So we already identified the consent and consent, sovereignty, and contract. We will now talk about the expansion. So how did this work? Okay, so expansion works in this way. So sabi dito, lawyers now establish that a state's territory should extend into the sea by the reach of a cannonball and later above its land to the flying height of a hot air balloon. Okay, so after gaining the sovereignty, uh, here is now the activities in every country. So they already identified the territory, the sea level, and the sky or airspace. So hindi lang doon sa country or sa land area mismo. So it includes the sea and the airspace. So that is part of their territory. So nag-expand na through the airspace and the sea level. Reflecting this new concern with the state boundaries, passports were introduced in Europe during the First World War. Okay? So meron ng nag-introduce na sila ng passports which they use whenever they go outside the country or whenever they engage with other countries. And to travel across frontiers became a rite of passage, involving the formal permission of the state officials as expressed by a stamp in a passport. So, whenever you cross other countries, that is your right to do that. However, before you cross or you pass with uh, before you pass the frontiers of other countries, you should seek any permission shown in the your passport na merong nakalagay na stamp. Okay? So that is how the state expanded. Okay, so the external territory or external boundaries were extended, and the internal activities of the government also began to expand, and many tasks were now taken for granted as public responsibilities only emerged in the 19th century. This included policing, elementary education, gathering statistics, and factory regulations. And for most of the 20th century, Western states bore ever deeper into their societies once again. This expansion was fueled by the demands of war. So we have here the First World War that started in 1914 to 1918, and the Second World War started in 1939 to 1945. So these world wars were the total conflicts demanding unparalleled mobilization of citizens, economies, and societies. These campaigns were fought by massive forces equipped with industrial weapons of tanks, planes, and bombs. Such conflicts were extraordinarily expensive. As a result, tax revenues as a proportion of national product almost doubled in Western states between the year 1930 and 1945. So the 20th century was an era of the war and therefore a century of the state. Okay, so sabi nga ni Tilly, sabi niya, war makes states, and in return, states makes war. Okay, so this expansion actually passed through several wars. Okay, so makikita nyo dito na the Treaty of Westphalia did not actually prevented war. Okay, it only laid down some of the foundation like state sovereignty and others. However, after the Treaty of Westphalia, marami pa ding nangyayari na maraming pa ding sumunod na mga wars, like the war in France, the World War II, the World War I, and etc. And these things are the reasons, or these wars caused the creation of the state. Okay, so that's all about the expansion. So, nag-expand na yung mga territories, external and internal. How about contraction? So, sabi ko kanina na yung mga war na yan, nag-cause siya ng damage, nag-double yung mga taxes, maraming mga nawala, tumaas ang demand pero kulang yung supply, so ganyan ang nangyari, nasira ang mga military artilleries and others. So here comes now the contraction. Okay, so since the expansion of the state proved to be expensive and ultimately unaffordable, so parang nung nag-expand, nag-contract ulit. So we have here in 1975, the proportion of national income which West European countries devoted to public social expenditure reached 30%, a tenfold increase compared to 1900s. Okay, another. So with the social democratic governments redistributing income in the name of greater equality, the top rate of income tax in Western countries will reach an inhibiting 63% by the mids of 1970s. Okay, so kung makikita nyo dito, halos tumaas na yung mga expenditure nila. Mas nag-double pa ang halos nag-double na yung mga expenditure nila. Okay? So, that's the time na medyo nagko-contract, nagpo-fall na ang ekonomiya. Okay, so as employment continued to expand, so the financial pressures also mounted. Following the oil crisis of the 1970s, speculation even began to emerge about whether governments might go bankrupt. Okay, so may mga speculation na ganyan. So natatakot na yung mga ibang bansa na baka mabankrupt sila. Rather like the empires of old, no sooner had the Western state reached its full extent than it began to look overstretched. Okay, so as a consequence, the final decades of the 20th century witnessed some retreat of the particular I mean, some of the retreat of these states, particularly the English-speaking countries where the conservative agenda linked with Ronald Reagan. Example. Another is that state-owned industries were sold. Welfare provision was strained and the state increasingly sought to supply public service indirectly using private contractors. Significantly, military demands were for once consistent with a diminished state spending on the armed forces declined after the end of the Cold War. Okay, so after the expansion, construction, or after the several wars, we have here now the post-colonial state. So let's not always forget that the state was born in Europe and then exported to the rest of the world by the colonial powers, namely the Great Britain, France, and Spain. Okay, so we have, the following slide will talk about the birth of these states or the freedom of several states from their colonial powers. Okay, so sabi ni Opello and Rosso, it is impossible to understand the development of a modern state without taking into account the way European states constructed an interconnected global order by means of conquest, trade, religious conversation, and diplomacy. Of all Europe's exports, the state is perhaps the most important. Okay, so according to them, we cannot understand the states today if we will not trace back on the history on how Europe conquest or colonized other countries within and outside Europe. Okay, so the post-colonial state will talk about how the new states how the new states created or began. Okay. Okay, so for the information of everyone, we have here the most of the states in the world were former colonies, including of course the United States of America. So most of them were colonized by the by the European countries like Great Britain, France, and Germany. Okay. However, there are also countries without colonization. Without a history of colonization. Let's say, for example, we have here Japan, Thailand in Asia, Ethiopia in Africa, Iran in the Middle East. Okay, so apart from these countries, we also have here uh, the former empires, notably Russia and China. Okay, so these are the countries that were not colonized by the European countries. Okay, so how then colonies emerge into statehood? Okay, so paano ba nag-emerge or paano ba naging state ang mga colonies ng iba't ibang countries in Europe. So paano ba naging country ang Pilipinas? Because we are also a colony of Spain. Spain, which is under Europe. Okay, so paano ba nag-emerge ang mga ito? So okay, so we have here now the second wave of decolonization. Okay, so the second wave of colonization and perhaps neglected wave of post-colonial statehood emerged in Europe and the Middle East in the final collapse of the multinational and religiously diverse Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires around the end of the First World War. Okay, so it resulted, the dissolved Austro-Hungarian Empire resulted to the separate states, which are the Austria, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Okay, so those are the countries that were that became independent after the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And another, Turkey, okay, Turkey of the Ottoman Empire, and also we have here the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. We have Iraq and Palestine that were also under the British and French control. And of course, the Russian Revolution also provided an opportunity for Finland, Estonia, Georgia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Ukraine to achieve at least a temporary independence. Okay, so that is the result of the second wave of decolonization. It's the dissolve. It's the dissolution of the countries. Colonies of Europe. So we have here now the third wave of colonization. It is in this group that states that the colonial legacy is the most pronounced, with ethnic groups strengthened by the imperial classification, battling to control the resources of the government. Once once the contest is won, the dominant group or individual sees the state as a mine to be exploited. Okay? The victor distributes resources to its supporters, often copying the coercive ruling style of the departing power. Okay, so that is the activities here in the third wave. The result is governments far removed from that found in the Western states. The third and largest wave of the state creation occurred in 1945, with the retreat from empire of European states diminished by war. The exemplar was Indian independence achieved in 1947. Many other colonies in Africa, Asia, and Middle East, including Iraq again, because sabi ko nga kanina, temporary ang independence nila, and the Caribbean followed suit. This wave of decolonization grew into a veritable tsunami. When you say veritable, parang unexpected, napagdami ng mga state na nabuo during that time. Okay, sabi dito, over 19 new independent states were created between 1944 and 1988, 1984. Okay, around half the world's current total. As a result, about 1 in 2 of the world's countries have existed as independent states for less than a century. Okay, so this third wave of decolonization is the biggest of all the waves of decolonization. Okay, so makikita ninyo dito na marami ng countries na decolonize, include in Africa, Asia, Middle East, and at least 90 new independent states were created during this wave. Okay, so we have here now the fourth wave of decolonization. Right, so the fourth and final wave of the state formation occurred in the final decade of the 20th century with the collapse of communism. Okay, so the collapse of communism marks the fourth wave of decolonization. It says here that the Baltic states and the dozen Soviet satellites in East Europe, such as Hungary, Poland, and Romania, achieved effective independence with the dissolution of the communist bloc previously dominated by the Soviet Union. In addition, the Soviet Union itself, in effect a Russian empire, dissolved into 15 successor states including Ukraine, Uzbekistan, and of course Russia itself. Okay, so these are the waves of decolonization. And when we say decolonization, it is the opposite of colonization. Alright, so let's now proceed with the state and international organization. Okay, so since we have already identified we have already identified the creation of the state, or how the state was created from and during the war. Okay, so yung mga na-colonized countries, naging independent na sila. So let's now talk more about the state and international organizations. So what are intergovernmental organizations? So these intergovernmental organizations are bodies whose members include states. Okay? So these are organizations na ang member nila ay mga states, mga countries. Okay? Intergovernmental organizations are established by treaty and usually operate by consent with a permanent secretariat. Okay, so hindi lang ito basta-basta na create, but it is created by the consent of every country. Okay, they include single-purpose entities such as the International Telecommunications Union, regional organizations such as European Union, and universal bodies such as the United Nations. Okay, so these are intergovernmental organizations, or these are considered as the international organization. Okay, so an example of intergovernmental organizations are, are the United Nations, International Labor, and the World Health Organization. Okay, so ano ba ang mechanisms ng mga international governments? It says here that one of their mechanisms are conferences, discussions, treaties, and pronouncements. So how are they going to use the conferences, discussions, treaties, and pronouncements? They are an appropriate response to global problems by an international community lacking a world government. Okay, so by signing into treaty, ito yung magiging effect niya. Okay, IGOs may be less visible than states, and they certainly lack the legitimacy of a direct election, but these points hardly justify the conclusion that IGOs are politically tame. In times of peace, the IGO network spins a web of conference around even the strongest states. Okay, so these are the function of the IGO, and these are the mechanisms that is being used by the intergovernmental organization in order for them to act or implement their implement their goals and objectives. So it is by conference, discussion, treaties, and pronouncement. We have here the goals of every IGO. So sabi dito, membership of universal organizations, especially the UN, confirms to all and sundry that national rulers have acquired statehood and sovereignty. Okay. Another, IGOs help to endorse unpopular policies, providing national governments with both a conscience and a scapegoat. Of course, we don't want to close your deal, but the European Union insists on it. Okay, so those are some of the goals of the IGO. Another, IGOs perform useful functions. Everyone gains from a world telephone network and from safer nuclear power. Okay, so these are the goals of intergovernmental organization. Next is the regional organizations. Okay, so what are regional organizations? So pareho ba sa intergovernmental organization? Okay, so sabi dito, regional bodies are a specific form of IGO in which neighboring governments join together for common purposes, most often trade. These agreements have multiplied in numbers and significance since the end of the Cold War, as countries which once sheltered under the skirts of a sun power have turned to their neighbors to find a response, to international economic pressures. Okay, so these regional organizations are organizations that is being formed by neighboring governments or neighboring countries like the Southeast Asian countries, or yes, the Association of the Southeast Asian Countries, also the North American Free Trade Organization, association. And most of their common purpose is to trade. Okay, so most of the common purpose ng mga ito na regional organization na ito is to trade with each other. Kasi 'di ba, if other country did not permit you to trade with them, hindi ka pwedeng mag-export, mag-import ng mga product mo doon. Okay, so usually trade ang ano nila, and they are talking about the tariffs. So pwede bang babaan ang mga to, yung mga import and export. So those are the things that is being discussed in the regional organization. Okay, so let's have now here the purpose of the regional organization. So ano pa ang purpose nila? Bakit pa kailangan nilang mag-create ng regional organization na meron naman na tayong intergovernmental organization? Okay, so it says here that most regional associations are simple free trade areas with little prospect of institutional development. Their purpose is to secure gains from trade from their members without compromising political sovereignty. For that reason, their political impact is likely to be unplanned and indirect. Okay, so these are the purpose of regional organization. As I said earlier, it is purely for free trade. Okay, so these organizations are formed for to say that there is a free trade zone, or you are free to export and import, or mas konti ang babayaran mo na buwis pagpasok mo doon. So yung mga ganyan na guidelines na di-discuss sa regional organization. Okay, so if we have intergovernmental organization and we have regional organization, we also have the non-governmental organizations. So ano yung mga non-governmental organizations na ito? So international non-governmental organizations are private institutions with members or groups drawn from more than one country. Examples are the International Red Cross, Greenpeace, and the Catholic Church. Okay, so when we say non-governmental organization, so these are private. They are not government, so they are working as a private international organization, and usually they help in aiding the activities of the government. Let's say, for example, Red Cross, the Greenpeace, and others, Oxfam. So these are non-governmental organizations. They also act as a channel for distributing aid and implementing associated policy. Okay, so yung mga ganyang activity. NGOs possess clear attractions to outside donors. They are more efficient and less corrupt than many domestic governments, and they are also more sensitive to local political conditions than the military forces. So that is the characteristics of the non-government organization. Usually sila pa yung nag-check and balance ng mga government activities. Kung may mga sakuna, meron sila yung mga organization din nila ang nagbibigay ng nagdi-distribute or nagbibigay ng mga ayuda. So those are the function of the non-governmental organization. At sabi dito, mas less corrupt pa sila compared sa mga governmental organization. Okay? So that is all about non-governmental organization. And let's now proceed with another topic. We have here now the state in the global economy. So how will you, how can you say that there is a global economy? Okay, global economy is a convenient phrase to describe the growing trend for economic activity to operate between countries and even beyond them. Currency and trading, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, wherein international trade grew apace while production and especially finance broke free of national restraints. Okay? So that is all about the global economy. Okay, so in this topic, we are going to discuss how does countries, how does rich and poor countries works. Okay, so let's take a look on the developed countries. So, anong meron sa mga developed country or ano ang mga qualities ng mga developed countries? So, pag sinabi mong developed country, ma-figure out mo or makikita mo itong external or major external economic forces nila, which is the multinational corporations and, of course, the global financial flows. Itong multinational corporations na ito yung mga major na source of income nila. So, investment ng mga multinational corporation and of course, global financial flows. So, one of their major source of income is ito, global financial flows. So, yung pangungutang nila sa ibang bansa, borrowing of money from the international banks. Okay? So, that is that's how developed country works. And if you can see here in that picture, mas ganyan ang mga bahay-bahay nila. Makita ninyo na develop talaga. Okay, so ano naman, bakit sila nag-gain mismo dito sa multinational corporations? Dahil itong mga corporation na ito ang nagbibigay sa kanila ng income or sila mismo ang nagpapaangat sa kanilang status. Let's say, for example, Siemens, Johnson, Thales, and others. Okay, so we have here also the developing countries. So if you're going to compare the buildings of the developed countries from that of the developing countries, ito ang makikita ninyo. So when we say developing countries, so ganyan. And makikita mo sa building mismo, sa dami ng tao, maraming population, pero tignan mo yung mga buildings na ganyan. Unlike sa developed countries, at least kahit na marami ang population nila, pero mas magandang mga facilities nila, buildings, and other services. Okay? So, saan ba nagkikling or saan ba ang nanggaling ang economic forces ng mga developing countries? So, sabi dito, developing country may depend on a single market for its exports. Okay? So, single market lang ang ginagawa nila. So, kung gusto, let's say for example, pag nag-export lang sila ng oil lang talaga ang ginagawa nila. Hindi sila nag-aangkat ng iba or kulang sila sa machinery to process more from that natural resource, which is oil. So that is the source of economic fund of the developing countries. Another here is that locked into dependence on rich countries. The result is unbalanced development. Okay, so masyado silang nakadepend sa mga rich na countries. Bakit sila nakadepend sa mga rich na countries? Dahil nga, they cannot provide their own. So, sa theory mismo ni Immanuel Wallerstein, it explained how the countries are, how the rich countries are getting richer while the poor countries are getting poorer. And also, the dependency theory, sabi na dito na mas nagdi-depend ang mga countries, from the poor countries to the rich countries, resulting into an unbalanced development. So, kapag nagdi-depend ka palagi, wala ka ng improvement. Okay, so that is the developing countries. Okay, so let's say for example, an incident. Okay, so the developing countries tend to sell their products to the developed countries or the first world countries. Okay, so binebenta nila yung mga natural resources nila ng mga mahal, mura, and later on yung mga developed countries, since they have the machineries, they have the technologies to process these natural resources, they manufactured it and ibebenta nila sa mga poorer countries or the developing countries ng mahal. Okay, so pag makikita mo talaga yung unbalanced na development. Okay, so nagbenta ka ng mura, tapos pag na-process na nila, bibilhin mo ng napakamahal. And that's the thing, or that's the reason why countries in the first world and second world countries are getting richer while the countries in the third world are getting poorer. Okay, so that is all about the developed and developing countries. And this ends our discussion for the evolution of the state. Okay, so if you have any question about this discussion, please just write it down in the comment section and I will just give you back a reply. Okay, so that's all for today and see you guys on our next virtual class.